of the most fundamental as well as controversial economic theories and political subjects in world history is the idea of socialism, a very broad, ambiguous, not exactly understood, but also very difficult to understand economic system that is really applied in almost every nation at some point in history, but really has to be analyzed to examine what exactly its repercussions, implications, and core elements are. This is because socialism, contrary to much public debate about it, is really very difficult to define, because the word itself, unlike other economic systems like capitalism, for instance, and communism, is very difficult to pinpoint one exact word or phrase that describes all of its elements, consequences, and framework. Because socialism is really an umbrella term. It can apply in many different retrospects, involves many different economic systems within it, and has many different interpretations as to what its policy should be. However, many economists and political historians and theorists generally agree that socialism, at its core, revolves around two ideologies, two principles. That is, government control of industry and the redistribution of wealth for the benefit of the community. Now, basically what that means is that at its core, the philosophy of socialism is the existence of a collective society, of a community, and a general public will or a communal interest that all people who live in a particular society have to some degree, but not uniform degree, common interest that needs to be furthered through some kind of an authority, such as government or the state. This is very critical to understand because while it might seem to some rather appealing or demeaning to others, it really can apply in many different circumstances and is very malleable to different opinions. So, for example, government control of industry, that's the first element. This is very critical to understand because it's very different from ideologies within, for instance, communism, which advocates for government abolition or government domination or authorization of industry. What government control of industry means, while it's a very broad spectrum that can lean from less control to absolute control on the communist spectrum, well that very far end that I mentioned of domination is more communist. What really control means is that there is government or state or authority influence. There is some kind of a regulation or bar on the practices of an open, free market or industry. What it means is that there is not abolition, end, or domination of the authority on an economic market, but there is control of it. What this means is that, let's say, let's go to a very basic example. Let's do it as in the previous capitalism segment. Let's go back to that good old Town A again. Town A. Let's say that Town A has a government, and let's say there's an industry. Let's say it's an oil industry, for instance, or an oil business. Now, let's say that oil business is engaging in pollution. It's later found out through an investigation that they are polluting the water supply that is used for freshwater drinking in Town A. Now, what a socialist would argue, what the socialist perspective is that the government should interfere, should step in, and basically tell that business, that oil business, that they can no longer do that. Create a regulation that bans them from, let's say, polluting or dumping its waste into that reservoir, into that freshwater supply area. That's the idea of government control of industry, that there is some kind of a control of a particular business or industry for the betterment of the community, in theory. Now, this can range in modern society to the idea that, for instance, the government has bans on child labor, the government has a minimum wage, the government requires that there be holidays and breaks for workers, there be an 8-hour workday, and many other regulations that serve as examples of, to a degree, a socialist framework, as the government, the state, which serves the common public interest of the community, is enforcing a particular regulation, is asserting to a degree control on the free market as to what the interests of the overarching society are. Now, the second most important element of socialism is redistribution of wealth. And I have to emphasize this because it's very important that every word in this phrase be understood properly. First of all, the way that socialism, in a very general perspective, works differently from, let's say, communism, is that communists believe in a very specific directive when it comes to income and wealth redistribution. What they believe is they actually don't believe in wealth redistribution. They believe in wealth distribution. The re-prefix implies that only a part of the wealth, whether it's the majority or the minority of the collective community's wealth, is redistributed and used by the state to invest in the overall community. In communism, remember, we'll get to that in another segment, but there's no private wealth. There is no market, there's no free market that is controlled by the individuals. Basically, all wealth is owned by the state. That the collective is the only thing that matters, and all the wealth is equally and evenly redistributed amongst the population. In socialism, in a very broad understanding of more moderate or right-leaning socialism, the idea is redistribution of wealth. That a segment of the population's wealth is redistributed in different sectors that benefit the population. So examples of that can include police, libraries, roads, the social security, fire departments, any basic service that is employed by the state that involves the extraction of wealth from the population and investment in the public interest in socialist theory involves, to a degree, socialism. As, remember, the government is controlling the wealth of the community because to pay for those basic services that apply uniformly to the population, they have to get the money from somewhere. And the money comes from tax revenue. What they do is they control the income or the revenue of individuals or of markets by taxing them, by taking a segment of their wealth and redistributing it amongst the population. That idea, philosophically, is a segment of socialism. In a perfect anti-socialist world, there would be no government control, there would be no taxation, there would be no wealth redistribution. It's all up to the private individual and the private and completely free markets to operate. And that basically takes place in other economic theories we might get into another time, called anarcho-capitalism or radical libertarianism or other ideas that are very curious to explore as they explain different elements of socialism, or the relationship with socialism, either alongside it or as the antithesis of it. One of the last things to understand when it comes to socialism is, as I said in the very beginning, socialism is a huge umbrella that involves those very general ideas of government control of industry and the redistribution of wealth. What that means is that it can apply in many different circumstances. So really, to a degree, any economic system that involves any government control has some socialist elements, whether it be communism, which is the idea that the state and the collective society has complete control of industry, as a matter of fact, abolishes private industry and abolishes free markets and determines that basically all wealth is redistributed amongst the population. Or it can even go to notions like basic regulatory capitalism, in which there's a mostly free market in which individuals get to choose their own pursuits of happiness, their own goods, their own services, their income, how much they choose to make, what businesses they choose to pursue, but there is regulation of some of the practices of both the consumers and the free market. And this can be observed in almost every modern society today, there's no real society today, or even throughout history, that didn't have some kind of government control to some extent at some time. And to understand this concept even more, we can even look at times back in the United States in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s under the New Deal programs, in which taxes were extremely high, in some cases as high as 94% during the 1930s, and there was massive public investment in basic services that benefited the community, such as a federal works program and an infrastructure program that invested in public infrastructure, the rebuilding of roads, projects, new industries, etc. There were food stamps supplied to many individuals who were poor, can't afford their own food. There was the creation of regulatory boards that allowed for labor strikes and labor unions to exist. There was youth opportunities programs that supplied scholarships and opportunities to young people seeking education, the creation of Social Security or a guaranteed retirement, of public schools, of public utilities, and many more examples of how the government basically took the money from a huge amount of it from a majority of the population and invested it in the market, but worked in junction with capitalism to basically allow for free will and free market with a steady, strong government hand. Now, all of this is very interpretive, very complex, and there's many different theories and opinions about it, but nonetheless, it is an important concept to understand when dealing with basic economic and political theory.